Welcome to Black History in Upstate New York. This program was produced by Victoria Basulto in conjunction with the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum and funded by the Catherine W. Davis Projects for Peace Fellowship awarded through Colgate University. Black History in Upstate New York will provide a combination of bite-sized informational videos and longer presentations by scholars on historical figures and places that emphasize the crucial role Black Americans have played in the history of Upstate New York. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum honors anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery, and the legacy of that struggle, and strives to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. The Museum and Hall of Fame's contact information is available on the screen. Hello, and once again, welcome to Black History in Upstate New York. My name is Victoria Basulto, and it is my honor to introduce today's presenter, Susan Gdir. Susan Gdir is an assistant professor of history at the State University of New York at Oneonta. She studies and teaches 19th and early 20th century women's rights activism. She earned a master's degree in gender history, a doctorate in public policy history, with subfields in international gender and culture and Black women's studies, and a women's studies master's degree, all from the University at Albany. At SUNY Oneonta, she teaches a range of courses in women's history, as well as courses in New York State history, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and progressivism. In addition to working on the biography of Louisa Matilda Jacobs, the daughter of Harriet Jacobs, author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, her current manuscript project is Networks of Activism: Black Women in the New York State Suffrage Movement. The University of Illinois published her first book, No Votes for Women: The New York State Anti-Suffrage Movement, in 2013. Her second book, co-authored with Karen Pastorello, is Women's Will Vote: Winning Suffrage in New York State. I'd like to now invite Susan Gdir to begin her presentation.
All right, thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to talk to you about a woman who's not very well known, but was involved in procuring rights, equal rights, both for African-American people and for women more specifically. This is Louisa M Jacobs, Matilda Jacobs, and she was involved in a very early suffrage organization called the American Equal Rights Association. And I want to talk a little bit about how she got involved with that. You'll hear me talk a little bit about how I got interested in this particular woman, and I'll go on and tell you some of the story of her and her activism for equal rights. Louisa Matilda Jacobs was born about 1833 October, and she was the daughter of Harriet Jacobs. Now, Harriet Jacobs was born in Edenton, North Carolina. She was born enslaved. She had a life that was severely circumscribed by being enslaved. Her first mistress had promised her freedom, and that did not actually happen. She became the property of a daughter of a man named James Norcom. And James Norcom, by the time Harriet was about 13 or 14 years old, he began to put pressure on her to have intimate relations with her. And Harriet Jacobs had no interest in that and had a very creative way of resisting him. She did two things. One, she entered into a relationship with another powerful white man in the community. With him, she had 2 children, a son, and then Louisa, born 2 years later. I said there were 2 ways that she resisted. The second way was to hide in her grandmother's attic for 6 years and 11 months, almost 7 years. And that's another whole story. Well, that's a book that Jacobs wrote about, Harriet Jacobs wrote about, a story she wrote about and published, and that took some time. She stayed hidden for almost 7 years. She eventually found her way north. Her daughter was already in the north by that time, and she and her daughter ended up getting involved in New York in some activism in other places, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, other places. So I'll talk just a little bit about that, but I really want to focus on my subject, which is the daughter. So what I wanted to tell you was that Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, if you haven't read it, put it on your list of books that you must read. It is an amazing story. And it is a story that comes to us because although scholars knew for years and years that Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was an abolitionist book, there were some people who thought that this was written by a white woman, Lydia Maria Child, who was also an abolitionist, but she had had something to do with it being published. She was not the writer. And so another wonderful scholar, Jean Fagan Yellen, looked at this book and said, there's some interesting information here. Well, Harriet Jacobs had taken every individual that was in the original story and had given them pretend names, had given them pseudonyms. Every single person in there, she had given pseudonyms. So it was easy to discount this as an abolitionist document. Well, Jean Fagan Yellen was not to be deterred, and she finally came up with the key to the entire story of the true story of Harriet Jacobs. And that was in a letter. So Harriet Jacobs wrote a letter to a friend. And in that letter, she mentioned that she had been hiding in an attic. She had gone back to Edenton, North Carolina, had hidden in that attic, and she talked about the sadness that she felt after all of those years. Because the letter was to a white woman, an abolitionist, that letter was discovered, and it provided the key because it not only made the connection with the hiding in the attic, it also made the connection with Edenton, North Carolina. And this letter comes in 1867, which is the year I want to pick up on Louisa's story. So Louisa Jacobs was her daughter. And this image on the left is the only known image we have, and we're not positive about it being Louisa Jacobs, but the garment looks correct. What we know of her and her grace and her elegance, she was described as being rather tall, very elegant, and as a woman who could have a presence in her demeanor, that kind of grace. So we're pretty sure, and this is photograph that Jean Fagan Yellen discovered. So that's, we're going to use that as Louisa Jacobs. Now, Louisa Jacobs and her mother were living together in the Boston area during the time that Louisa was growing up and getting her education. And they, during this time, Harriet Jacobs is writing her book. Louisa and she are working, making their way as best they can. And Harriet Jacobs writes Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and it gets published in January of 1861. Now, those of you who know the timeline of 19th century US history know that in April of 1861, the war actually breaks out. The Civil War begins in April. So it's just a few months before that her book is published. And really, at that time, no one knew all of the connections other than, and Harriet Jacobs herself used a pseudonym, Linda Brent. And so people knew that she wrote the book at that time. But she doesn't get a lot of time to promote the book. There is a copy in the Library Company of Philadelphia of one of the very first edition, copy of the very first edition of her book, and that was granted as a gift to someone else in the Philadelphia area. And then they, in turn, gave that to the Philadelphia Library Company, which I've seen, and she signed it and said where she was at the time. So it was very cool. Anyway, so during the war, Harriet Jacobs travels with money from the Quakers to Alexandria, Virginia. And there she is joined by her daughter, and they run a school called the Jacobs School. So Alexandria, Virginia, that's where they are during the war itself. So their work is with the freed people that made their way to Alexandria, Virginia. Now, this is another whole story in and of itself. I just want you to know where they were during that time. Now, Louisa Jacobs had gotten enough education to be able to help with the school, to be a teacher, to then go on. She did a lot with what was called at that time the industrial arts, so practical handwork. And this is actually something that Louisa Jacobs takes through her life and her career. She'll eventually work at Howard University in Washington, D.C., but that's a little bit later on. She also, and another pattern that we see is her teaching in the Sunday schools. And again, we see her doing that well along throughout her life. So this is what they're doing during the war, beginning about 1863 through 1864. And when the war ends in 1865, and that was probably the fastest Civil War story you've ever heard, they are staying in Alexandria, Virginia, just long enough to kind of wrap things up for a while. Now, the end of 1865, they do some interesting things. For one thing, Louisa writes a letter and says she has viewed Abraham Lincoln's body. He was assassinated in April of 1865. She's gone there. And another interesting little tidbit in her story is that she and her mother travel to Richmond, Virginia, and have tea at the home of the former Confederate President Jefferson Davis. And it's a thing to do. Well, they then move on, they go into Savannah, Georgia. They're working again with freed people, so deeper into the South. There's another whole story about how they want to travel from Savannah, Georgia to New York. And they get on a steamship line and they're forced off the ship, although they've bought first class tickets. They're forced off, and Louisa actually takes that to court. And I tell you this because it's an indication of how difficult it is for people of color, even when they pay for their passage, to travel during this time. And this isn't just exclusively in the early civil rights, civil activism that we're particularly focused on. This continues. We'll see a lot, there are a lot of women and men who soon travel trains. Sometimes it's the trolleys. There's a lot of this story. But again, that's another topic. I just want you to be aware of it before we get into the next part I want to talk about with you. So now I'm going to back up just a tiny bit and talk just a little bit about the American Equal Rights Association. So in the years leading up to and during the Civil War, and in the couple of years right after, there's not really a women's rights organization. There are annual meetings. And by the time we get to 1866, two things. One, the United States government is trying to figure out what to do with all those freed people. People like those Harriet Jacobs and Louisa Jacobs have been working with. And the women's rights movement is trying to, or is being birthed in a way. All right. So the United States is discussing, debating, and ratifying 3 amendments in these early years that cover the Equal Rights Association period. The 13th Amendment, which makes slavery illegal everywhere in the United States and its environments, is discussed, debated during the first year after the war ends. It is ratified in December of 1865, so that same year. Now, at the same time, the Congress begins debating another amendment. That's the 14th. That 14th Amendment, some of the proposals are, first of all, it's going to make freed people citizens, but it's going to add an adjective, and that adjective is male. So all freed people are citizens, but they're now described as male. And at that point, both abolitionists and women's rights activists are very concerned. And so they begin to talk in May of 1866 about a new organization that will bring together abolitionists and women's rights activists in a meeting. And it's actually the 11th Women's Rights Convention. So it's not an organization, but it's a convention. At that convention, they determine that they will form a new organization that will be named the American Equal Rights Association. And it will bring together women and men, Black and white, to work together for universal suffrage. This is the first organization that actually is working for women's rights and Black rights at the same time. So the American Equal Rights Association, being the first of its kind, is run by a number of very prominent activists that include prominent white activists, prominent Black activists, and it's a rich, interesting organization. It's a lot of firsts. Just as a little bit of a side point that I want to make, it thought of itself as being as important as it was at the time. And that gives us sources that help us to understand a little bit more about the organization. It's this image that I have here is the cover of their first report. So it comes from 1867, but it's really looking back at 1866 and its founding. So it's a really interesting document because of that. So in 1866, the leaders of this association, which include people that are well known at that time, Lucretia Mott is president. She's a Quaker, a white woman who is known for her ability to help people get along with each other. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, names you know and recognize. But it also includes some other people like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who is an African-American woman who is very dynamic and outspoken, and she does not pull any punches. She's from Pennsylvania. She travels around, speaks at a number of these organizations, has a tendency to be at these organizations and at these meetings. Frederick Douglass comes into it. He's one of the vice presidents. Another man who's very prominent in Philadelphia as a abolitionist and equal rights man, Robert Purvis. So there's some very exciting people involved in this organization. I will show you a picture in a moment of Charles Lennox Riemann. Riemann was probably the most prominent abolitionist of his time, a Black man abolitionist of his time until Frederick Douglass came into the picture, and they didn't always get along with each other. Another interesting story. But anyway, so what they decide in 1867 is to have a tour of upstate New York. And the tour will be for the purposes of getting people on the ground, the constituents, those people on board with universal suffrage, in other words, men and women, Black and white, in time to influence the 1867, June 1867 Constitutional Convention, State Constitutional Convention. New York was very influential at the time, and the leaders of this activist organization felt that if they could convince the New York legislature through the Constitutional Convention to enfranchise all citizens of voting age, that it would then influence a federal amendment as well, the 14th Amendment that they were trying to influence. So they agree that they will hold a tour. And that tour Now imagine this, that tour was set to begin late in December of 1866. Now, any one of us who's ever traveled across upstate New York in the months of late December, January, February, March, April knows that that's a challenge. So I want you to imagine, without having a real lot of evidence from any of these participants, how hard it was to travel across upstate New York in the winter of 1867. And the snows, as far as I can tell, and I'm not a weather person, but they're something like 3 and 4 feet deep. The temperatures in January and February weren't much above 0 degrees. I mean, this is not a fun tour, but there's a group of people who agreed to do it. Now, many of these tours that were taken by abolitionists, by women's rights activists across upstate New York, there's a number of ways that they could have traveled. I'm not sure, because none of the evidence that I have seen tells me specifically. They may have gone on the Erie Canal, which would have probably been frozen, and they could have taken sleds and gone across wearing heavy robes and blankets to keep them warm. It's also very, very possible that they took the train. Remember that we're having Black and white women and men traveling on this tour. Now, Susan B. Anthony organized the tour. She would write to people she knew in each and every town, and she would say, we have people who are going to be lecturing, and they will need accommodations. So let's back up just a second and remember that Louisa Jacobs is the key to this story. She joins the tour. We don't know how. She comes into New York very late in 1867. I personally think that Charles Lennox Riemann invited her on the tour. She did not have speaking experience. She had never done this before, and she does join with Riemann and Anthony and Olympia Brown, a number of other people on the tour. Now, this map comes from the University of North Carolina Press. This is a map that is found in a 2-volume set of the Harriet Jacobs family papers. I'm using it here with permission. And each of these points is a place on the tour. And I want to focus just a moment. If you look to the right, Brockett's Bridge and Herkimer. That area, some of you might be familiar with that part. So one of the more eastern stops on this tour. Normally what would happen is the group would go to one of these towns, whether it's in Troy, in Schenectady, in Lockport, in Buffalo, and they would hire a building to speak. They would talk about universal rights. It might be 2 or 3 times that they would meet. Now, when they go, and here's another little piece of the story, for African-American people who tour, they have to have a place to stay. They can't just pop into some hotel. And so in this case, in the Herkimer Brockett's Bridge area. And here, this is a photograph on the left of Charles Riemann. And this is a place where we know that Charles Riemann and Louisa Jacobs stayed. This house still exists. It doesn't look the same at all. This is from a newspaper photograph that was published back in 1960s. It's as close to what it looked like in its time, but it is seriously altered now. I've driven by it and I've looked and looked and looked. Anyway, Zena Sprocket, who owned the house in what was at that time Brockett's Bridge, which is now Dowageville, was a leading abolitionist. And he actually was a member of the American Equal Rights Association. And Riemann and Louisa Jacobs stopped and stayed with him. He was a white man for about 7 or 8 days. And during that time, Riemann wrote a number of letters, talked about the tour, and that's part of what you're hearing me describe about what it was like to go on the tour. He talks about the weather not being very nice, but he doesn't tell us how they traveled. So anyway, the point of my telling you this is the evidence that we have of a place that 2 African-American people were able to stay during this tour in 1867. All right, now, are they successful? No. This tour meets a lot of people, influences a lot of people, but fails to influence the Constitutional Convention delegates for the decision in June of 1867. But it's important. Why is it important? It's important because this organization, the American Equal Rights Association, shows us a time of cross-gender and cross-race activism. I would argue that that is the only way that we can change anything in the United States. There needs to be this kind of work across difference. One of the things that makes this so difficult is that it is a time of a process where one group gets the right to vote, which Black men do with the 15th Amendment, which is ratified in 1870. And then women have to work another several decades in order to get the right to vote. And so it starts that process. And that's kind of become a tendency in the United States. One group gets something, another group doesn't, then another, and then another one will get it later on, instead of it being a blanket granting, earning of rights. Another major point I would make is that change takes place in the United States from the bottom up. It's people, it's plain old everyday people working across gender, across race, across difference. But in order to make those changes, they don't come from the top down. It is agitation from the bottom up. That's incredibly important. The final point I'd like to make with you is that those decades of activism, and most of you know that in 2020, women celebrated getting the right to vote, and that's with a lot of caveats because not all women did. Native American women, it took much longer. Sometimes it took, for Latin American women, many women of color, it took until the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. It's not secure even today, not for anyone. And that those rights for voting and other civil rights remain at risk, and that's what we're seeing. Well, that wasn't a very happy note, except keep remembering that the change takes place from the bottom, and that it's people that make those changes, and that we will continue to do so and to work for that. Thank you for being here with me today, and I appreciate it very much.
I'd like to thank Susan Gdir for that wonderful presentation. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for joining us today. If you'd like to learn more about women's suffrage in New York State, I highly recommend you read Susan Gdir's book, No Votes for Women, the New York State Anti-Suffrage Movement. I also recommend that you read the book that she co-authored with Karen Pastorello, Women Will Vote, Winning Suffrage in New York State. Both of these books will be linked in the video description. Additionally, please fill out the survey linked in the video description and also available if you type in the link on the screen in your URL. This will allow you to provide feedback about the specific presentation or the program in general. Your feedback will help us in the formulation of future presentations and programs like this one. Thank you, and I hope we see you again tomorrow.